As we have MPA members on the call, we're obligated under the Competition Act and our Code of Conduct. So all participants agree to comply with their obligations under the Competition Act, Enterprise Act, Competitions and Market Authorities undertakings, Cement Market Data Order and the Price Announcement Order 2016. Members joining this virtual meeting agree that they will not at any time during the virtual meeting engage in any form of anti-competitive practices, including exchange of price information. In addition, exchange of other financial or sales information is prohibited where, for example, it is possible to disaggregate information to identify participants. All those attending this meeting will also be expected to respect the behaviours and standards of the Code of Conduct issued by the MPA. Just some housekeeping. Just please be aware of your local health and safety arrangements. If you have to leave the call for any reason, please do so. You don't need to announce that you're going. Please ensure everyone has their microphone muted when not speaking. We kindly request that all questions are left open to MPA members and that they are only asked at points where a presenter indicates they will accept questions or at the end of a presentation. If you wish to ask a question, raise your hand. Please turn on your camera if you're willing to do so. Please don't feel obliged to do that. We're not generally going to make any introductions, although please do introduce yourself in the chat if you feel you want to. And please do feel free to introduce yourself before asking your question. You can also ask questions in the chat function. Leonie and myself will monitor these questions because we're requesting questions to come mainly from MPA members. Please put MPA at the beginning of your question so we can identify which are member questions. That is not to say that we will not have questions from other regulators if they're time free during the question sessions and regulators would like to ask questions when no MPA members have asked questions, then please do so. If you do wish to ask anonymous questions, because we're conscious of sensitivities around the subject, then please do direct message myself or Leonie or email us during the call and we're more than happy to ask on your behalf. And I shall now pass over to Leonie to introduce some of our colleagues.
Hi, good afternoon. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Leonie Morgan and I work for the Environment Agency as a Senior Advisor and Technical Lead for the cement and lime sector. I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting, which I hope will be interesting, informative and above all useful. We've arranged this meeting to support you in the work you're doing to decarbonise. And this is about sector engagement, EA industry engagement. So we don't want this solely to be us talking to you. So we're keen to hear from you. So please ask your questions. And if there are any issues that we need to be aware of, please do talk about that as well. So I encourage you to ask your questions. And if there are questions we can't answer, we will take those away. I'd like to thank Michael and the MPA for setting this meeting up and hosting. And a big thank you to my colleagues for agreeing to present and the time and effort they've spent preparing. You have the sort of technical leads, the expertise giving you this information. So you are hearing it from the horse's mouth, as it were. Just to point out, there's a small change to the issued agenda in that after the break, we will have the ETS talk and then the carbon capture storage permitting talk. And just before I hand over to John for the first talk, I'd like to introduce a few colleagues on the call who are here and available in case there are any questions in their area of expertise, but they aren't presenting themselves, so they won't be giving them a specific introduction. So if I can talk first to hand to Kay Champion. Thanks, Kay.
Thank you. Thanks for a warm welcome. My name is Kay Champion and I'm just recently joined actually as the Decarbonisation Manager. So some of those you'll be hearing from today, including John, sort of work for me within my line management. So the technical expertise is there. And I guess our role is to sort of help develop and implement the regulatory approach to decarbonisation. So I guess my team will be sort of engaging with many of you in the future. So thanks for inviting me along to sort of listening today. If I can answer any questions, I will, but I'm hoping people like John and others will be able to do that on my behalf.
Great, thanks, Kate. And then Jane Durling.
Hi, Jane Durling. I'm Senior Advisor in the hydrogen carbon capture team. So my focus is on hydrogen. So anything around hydrogen production, storage, overview of use as well. Although my colleague Richard Chase also is looking at use of hydrogen. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. And Jenny Holmes.
Hello, I'm Jenny Holmes. I am an advisor in water resources resilience, and my team is looking at updating the national framework for water resources. So the national framework, the first one was a document that explored England's long-term water needs. And what we're doing is refreshing that, updating the figures, and we're looking more at multi-sector planning and water requirements for industry, energy and agriculture, amongst other things. So I'm here because water is going to be a limiting factor in developments in the future, so it needs consideration within planning. So yeah, I'm here representing water resources today. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So thank you all, and I'll hand over to John Barraclough for the first talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Leonie. Just get my slides up, fingers crossed. Okay, can you see the slide without my notes?
Yes.
Yep, that's good. That's great, thanks. Okay, thanks, Leonie, and thanks. Just wanted to reinforce a message about being invited to talk today. Thanks for the opportunity. I think you may have met me previously. I did come to a meeting last year with Leonie to talk about some work we were doing to gather evidence on carbon capture in the cement and lime sector, and I think we had a bit of a discussion there, and I'm going to mention that piece of work a little bit later on. So I'm John Barraclough. I work in a National Environment and Business Directorate in what's called the Energy Industries Decarbonisation team. Myself and Jane are part of well, a new and emerging hydrogen and carbon capture program. I predominantly spend most of my time working on developing our approach to regulating carbon capture. So Jane's working on hydrogen, I'm predominantly on carbon capture. And that involves, I suppose, quite broad really, quite a broad role, engagement with government and industry, developing guidance, supporting frontline decision, and trying to resolve some of the technical issues we've got around permitting carbon capture plants. I've also previously worked on helping to identify what some of the emerging energy technologies are that might be coming forward. And I do have a slide on this, so hopefully that will be of interest to you as well. So I'm going to, in the talk, briefly cover the EA's role as an enabler of UK net zero, and then talk about how we go about developing our guidance for emerging techniques. Now, I do have some slides as part of the guidance bit of my presentation on the UK BAT process. And I just wanted to say I don't actually work in the UK BAT team. As part of that team, I will try and answer any questions about the UK BAT process, but if I can't answer them, then we'll need to take them away if my colleagues can't answer them. Okay, so our climate ambition, our strategic priorities are set out in the EA's climate ambition. This document was signed off by EA board back in 2021. It's the heart of everything that we do, and it's aimed to help us to use our regulatory role to prevent further climate change happening, and also helping the country, industry, and wider stakeholders to be better prepared for the impacts of climate change. With our regulatory role, we see ourselves as a key enabler for change. The three strands of our climate ambition, the first one is really around our internal environmental management. So our our commitment to lead by example and become a net zero organisation ourselves by 2030, so that we're no longer contributing to climate change and supporting sustainable resource consumption. And some of the examples around our commitment. So we've made a commitment to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, a reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions of 80% by 2030. There's a large program of work looking at our fleet of vehicles. So we have a target to have zero carbon emitting fleet of cars and vans by 2027. And I know there's quite a bit of work gone ahead already on that. So it's been really successful. One of the other areas that's particularly a priority is our work around sustainable procurement and, if you like, our scope 3 emissions. Reducing those greenhouse gas emissions will play a major part in our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our construction projects. Our construction on flood defences alone contributes to half of our total greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can imagine, that is a significant win there if we can focus our efforts on those issues. Preparing for climate impact. So this is a second strand. So this is about helping the country by leading on issues such as having too much water. You're probably aware that we have a role in flood defense, and also we have a role in the availability of water as well. So dealing with situations where we have too little water. We have an important role as an as an incident responder, a regulator and advisor to the government, as well as advising our partners and businesses. And an example, we introduced a requirement recently for permit holders to integrate climate change adaptation into their management system. So there's an example. And then the last one, and the one which I have a separate slide on, is around UK, enabling UK net zero. And there's two main commitments here. The first one is a commitment to work with government as it shapes policy and investment necessary to put the UK in a path to becoming net zero by 2050. And then our second one is to play our part in driving down greenhouse emissions from those that we regulate. So the enabling UK net zero strand has three strategic priorities. The first one around regulating to drive down greenhouse gas emissions, and this is about enabling the sectors that we regulate to decarbonise whilst protecting and enhancing the environment. It has broad scope, this priority, across many aspects of our regulatory role. And an example of some of the work that we've been doing. So we recently published our methane action plan on gov.uk, which you may have seen. And this sets out how we'll use our powers as an environmental regulator to reduce methane emissions in England. So if you get a chance to have a look at that, that's worth a look. Regulating carbon markets is the second strand. So this is about supporting infrastructure that allows market mechanisms to operate and green finance to flow. And an example here is our role in the UK emissions trading scheme. And I know my colleagues are on the call today and will be giving an update on this later in the talk. And then the last one is really about circular economy and resource efficiency and helping to support sustainable resource consumption. So to support all these priorities, we've developed our enabling UK net zero plan, and this is a list of high-level strategic interventions where we feel we can have the biggest impact. Each of these priorities has director level ownership across the organisation, and I've just popped a few examples down the right hand side of the slide there that you can read yourselves, but I'll just pull out the one at the top, which is a bit that I'm particularly working on and my colleague Jane is working on, which is about developing our approach to regulating the emerging carbon capture and and hydrogen production technologies that are coming forward. So what are we doing to track emerging energy technologies? So this is a piece of work that we started about 3 years ago, and it's still evolving. So what we aim to do in this work was to try and identify what the potential technologies, what the processes were that were coming forward, and how we needed to regulate them, what we needed to do as a regulator to be ready for the applications coming forward. We focused the work around technologies that had a relatively high technology readiness level. As you can imagine, we have a finite resource in the organization. So we've really focused on the ones that are likely to come forward as a pilot project or likely to come forward for a permit application at some point in the future. Having said that, this is a rapidly evolving sector, so we are keeping an eye on the ones which were relatively low technology readiness, because those are the ones which will probably be high by the end of the year. So we probably need to understand what those technologies are likely to be. We then looked at what the likelihood of some of those technologies coming forward might be. And there's a number of ways that we've done that, obviously gathering intelligence from a number of sources, from trade bodies such as yourselves, and also from government priorities. So the British Energy Security Strategy and many of the government strategy documents have outlined what the government priorities are for some of these emerging technologies. There's been lots of competitions that the government have been financing, and that's helped to inform the types of technologies that we think are likely to come forward. We then start to look at what the regulatory controls were, so what the existing regulations cover. And this is quite an interesting one because there are some gaps. There are some gaps in the regulations around what we can and what we can't regulate. We are working with DEFRA to talk about what some of those things are. And just to give you an example, so if you took carbon capture, for example, we can only permit a carbon capture plant, which is a part of an installation. The regulation also specifically talks about carbon capture for geological storage. It doesn't talk about carbon capture for utilization. Although we can permit utilization if it's as a directly associated activity to an installation. But there is a gap there, because if you have a medium combustion plant with a carbon capture plant attached to it, we can't currently permit that because the medium combustion plant is not classed as an installation. So we've actually had such an application, and we did issue a permit a few months back for one of those sites, which we weren't able to permit a carbon capture plant. So those discussions are ongoing with DEFRA, and we're looking to see what the potential options are going forward. Carbon capture is just one example. There are other things as well, and I'm sure my colleagues might touch on some of those things later on in the presentation. Sorry, I'm trying to look at the slide because I've got my glasses on. We then looked at the existing tools and guidance to identify what guidance we had already, and what guidance we needed to develop and prioritize. And a little bit later on in this presentation, I've got some examples of some of the guidance that we've worked on. So we did identify that there were gaps. There were gaps in the guidance. We do have a list of priority pieces of guidance that we feel that we need to develop. And we also need to develop some tools to help our permitting officers to permit some of these types of development that might be coming forward. We tried to track developments that we're aware of. So we do have a bit of a tracker, particularly around the most prominent technologies. So hydrogen and carbon capture, for example, we have a long list of potential applications that might be coming forward. We're seeing more and more applications coming forward for both of those technologies. And again, some of my colleagues may comment on that later on. Some of the other things, energy storage and liquid fuels has been some of the things that we've been trying to look at as well to understand what those technologies might look like. And also things around energy efficiency. So we're mindful that the government has been supporting various initiatives to support businesses to become more energy efficient. We have an interest in what that might look like at some of the permitted sites. We also, as you're probably aware, have a responsibility for regulating the Energy Saving Opportunities Scheme. So we have an interest from that perspective as well. So we have been trying to track some of those things. Obviously, our engagement with trade associations like yourself is extremely important because you have a better understanding of the types of technologies that might be coming forward. So it's really helpful to have those conversations with yourselves. Obviously, our area colleagues, our area officers, we tend to engage closely with because they have the local intelligence on the ground, and we've been trying to map out what some of these developments might look like, particularly in cluster areas where there's broad scale developments coming forward. And then there's lots of things in through research and in the media that we're trying to track to get the picture and keep abreast of what these developments might look like. Okay, so so that was a little bit about the commitments that we've made as an organisation, just really an introduction to the types of work that we've been undertaking. So this part of the presentation is about the development of guidance, and it's mostly about how we approach guidance for emerging techniques. And the reason why we want to talk about this is because since we've been publishing our guidance, we've had lots of questions asked about what the status of our guidance is. So what is the difference between a BAT conclusion and our guidance for emerging techniques? So hopefully I'm going to be able to address that in this talk. Just to reinforce what I said at the beginning, I don't work directly on BAT, so if there's any questions, I'll take them away and present them to our UK BAT manager, Paul Stevens, who hopefully will be able to answer some of the questions. So just a bit of background on UK BAT then. So you're probably aware that since 2013, UK has been implementing the Industrial Emissions Directive. This directive specifically defined BAT as it's used in legislation. A series of BAT reference documents and BAT conclusion documents have been produced to define best techniques for industry to use, along with BAT associated emission levels. We then voted to leave the EU. So under the 2018 Withdrawal Act and the Environment and Wildlife Regulations, UK government and devolved administrations were given the powers to define BAT for the UK. The Environment and Wildlife Regulations outlined how the UK government and the devolved administrations would work together with an aim to establish UK-wide BAT. And just to say, the UK regulators do work together, but as the environment is devolved power, the administrations can independently define their own BAT if needed. So there was a consultation back in January 2021, which proposed a new regime for the UK. Hopefully you got the opportunity to see that consultation and respond on behalf of your members. And this consultation proposed some questions for the public and industry to consider and provide views on the proposed approach for the UK. The consultation response was published in August of 2022, and the outcomes from that consultation response were used to define the UK BAT process. So what does that look like? Well, there are effectively two elements to UK BAT process. So we have a standards council, we have the regulators group, we then have individual technical working groups, and then an advisory group. The Standards Council is the leadership group, which is focused on policy development and the overall governance of the UK BAT process. On that group, there are representatives from DEFRA, the UK environmental regulators, and the devolved governments, and it's actually chaired by DEFRA. The Standards Council give the go-ahead on the development of new BAT standards or BAT conclusions for the UK, and ministers are consulted as part of that that decision making. We then have the regulators group, and this group is more about having oversight of the operational technical delivery side of developing new BAT for the UK, new BAT conclusions. They also provide technical advice to the Standards Council. And within this group, there are representatives from each of the UK environmental regulators, so Environment Agency, NRW, SEPA and Northern Ireland. And they oversee the development of the new BAT standards. Once the Standards Council commissions work to produce new BAT conclusions, then technical working groups are set up by the regulators group. They are very similar to how it worked in Europe, I suppose, in that there's representation from each of the UK environmental regulators on those technical working groups. There's also industry representatives, such as trade bodies, such as the Mineral Products Association, NGOs, equipment suppliers, and that the aim is really to gather the evidence that's needed in order to set new standards, new BAT standards for the UK. Obviously, they'll look at evidence from elsewhere as well, not just in the UK, but international evidence that might be available. And authors of the new BAT conclusions will sit within that UK regulators technical working group. And timescales wise, so the target is from the point of commission to completion, the target is to develop new BAT standards within a period of 2 years. And then lastly, the advisory group. So this group provides independent view of the approach that's been taken to UK BAT with representation from NGOs, industry and academia. Now, the intention is that the UK regulators and work together on the development of new BAT for the UK. I mentioned that they're looking at evidence from the UK and internationally. They do strive to reach consensus, but it's important to emphasise that there is an option for devolved administrations to differ if needed and take their own approach.
Hi,
So,
John, can I
yes.
say 5 minutes, please?
But yeah, I'm almost there.
Thank you.
I'm
Great,
there, yeah.
thank you.
I've got 2 slides, I think, 2 slides. So that leads us on to the UK. So back developing guidance for emerging techniques. So this is, you may be aware of some guidance we published recently on a guidance for emerging techniques. So where the BAT is not addressed in existing BREFs, BAT conclusions, then regulators must follow Article 14.6 of the Industrial Emissions Directive to identify BAT for that emerging activity. So we carry out what's called an evidence review. So this is going out trying to identify what evidence is available, and then we use that evidence to draft guidance, which is published on gov.uk as guidance for emerging techniques. Now, before we can go ahead and develop new guidance for emerging techniques, we have to go to the regulators group that I mentioned on the previous slide to ask them for authorization to go ahead and develop that new guidance. So it is linked into the UK BAT process, the development of this new guidance. And also throughout the process, so once we get to the approval stage, then they would have to approve the final guidance that is proposed to be published on gov.uk. Just to say that we do consult with industry and stakeholders as part of the development of that guidance. And I think I mentioned earlier that we'd been involved in engaging with the Mineral Products Association, looking at potential evidence that might exist on carbon capture in the cement and lime sector. Almost there, Leonie, don't worry. Just a little bit about the status of a guidance, because we do get asked this question. So the guidance for emerging techniques does not have the same status as BAT standards found in BAT reference documents, BAT conclusions, except where existing regulations apply. The guidance is not a regulatory requirement, but it does identify best practice to address important environmental issues. And the UK environmental regulators would expect you to follow the guidance, but you can propose an alternative approach as long as it gives the same level of protection for the environment. And an example, I've got an example, I suppose, if there is issues around you with a carbon capture guidance, for example, indicates that you should aim to design your carbon capture plant and capture 95% CO2. If for a reason you felt you couldn't achieve that, then you should put that in the permit application, and we would consider that as part of a determination process. Obviously, for some technologies we haven't yet developed guidance. Here are some examples on my last slide here. So colleagues may mention this again later on, but there are 3 specific pieces of guidance that we've been working on. So Jane has published guidance on hydrogen production for methane reforming, hydrogen production from methane reforming, and also the electrolytic hydrogen production route. And I've worked with colleagues on developing post-combustion carbon capture guidance using amine solvent techniques, and we recently provided some updates to that guidance in the last few weeks. And then lastly, we're continuing to gather the evidence. So on the cement and lime side of things, so we do have some evidence that has been published on the UK Carbon Capture Storage Research Centre's website. But what we haven't done yet is we haven't interpreted the guidance to identify what additional we haven't interpreted the evidence to interpret what additional guidance we need to write to put on gov.uk. So that work is likely to go ahead in the near future. Leonie, I think that's my last slide. If there's any questions, I wasn't tracking the time, but presumably I was close to my half an hour.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions? There'll be opportunity hopefully at the end as well, if there's anything else that comes out. Okay, Andrew Jackson put his hand up.
Hi, Andy Jackson from Lowest. Thanks for the presentation. Just a quick question. Sorry if you covered it, but is there an obligation that the BAT process, and I know you might not be able to answer it, it's maybe for Paul, has to follow the IED? Or will it deviate, or do we expect it to largely follow the IED?
Okay, so as I understand it at the moment, actually Paul Wright, my colleague Paul has put his hand up, and Paul, I didn't realise Paul was on the call actually. So Paul, did you want to answer this one?
Yeah, sure. Just I'm Paul Wright, manager for regulated industry, for manufacturing industry regulation at the EA, and I also chair the regulators group that John mentioned. So probably best to answer this one. And the answer to your question is no. So for the first tranche of UK BAT conclusions, they were undertaking work that was already started in Europe. So we chose on that occasion to follow and finish off the work that was started. The second tranche, which is the tranche we are working on now, is also mirroring the EU process quite closely, mainly because it's the last group of industries to go through the VAT review process, and it seemed to make sense to finish that job off. The next tranche, which will be our tranche 3 of UK VAT, is very much yet to be determined, and we will be looking at what the priorities need to be for the UK, and they may or may not be the same as the EU priorities.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you.
I didn't realise you were on the call, Paul. You could have presented the UK bat slides.
You did it very nicely.
Thanks, Leo. Thanks, Leonie.
Thank you, John. Right, okay, I think we'll move on to the next session, which is on hydrogen. And I think my colleague Mark Taylor, who should be familiar to at least some of the cement companies, will kick off for us. Thanks, Mark.
Hi there. Hopefully you can see our hydrogen PowerPoint presentation on your screens.
It's not in presenter mode, it's just we can see the slides and the notes underneath.
There we go. Is
That's
that better?
Yeah, that's it.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. So some of you may have come across my name before or met me before. My name's Mark Taylor and I'm the Cement, Lime and Minerals Sector Lead in National Permitting. So I work quite closely with Leonie, but I'm here really to talk about some of the permitting aspects for hydrogen. And the presentation I'm going to try and get through very quickly the first part, which is production of hydrogen. And that's relating to, well, production at the installation. And the reason why I want to go through quite quickly is we've got Richard, who's going to talk a bit about some of the ELVs and the use of hydrogen within the fuel, and he has to leave at 2. So we can always go back to the production after 2 o'clock, if that's okay, if people have got questions to ask. So I'll move on. So yeah, production of hydrogen. There's a number of different regulatory activities that it could fall under in terms of applying for the production in your permit. What we expect mainly to see for cement, lime and mineral sites are the Part A1 4.2 inorganic chemicals activities for production of hydrogen, but there are other ones for people to be aware of, although we don't expect that they will be frequent for this sector. The sector itself, hydrogen isn't new. So back in, I think around 2020, we permitted a number of trials. So we did, I think, 3 cement works and 1 lime works. And they were for production of hydrogen and use of hydrogen. And they did it rather small scale. So some of them were limited to just a limited trial, and then we had a few other who went a bit further beyond that, and they've got permanent usage. Obviously, as I mentioned before in the previous slide, it's a specific regulated activity in its own right. So for those sites that did apply for it, they had to have an additional S4.2 activity in their permit. And what we did for a number of them was to limit them, well, for all of them was to limit them to low impact criteria. Now, you can't apply for a low impact permit when you are part of an existing installation, but in virtue of the costs and the actual size of the plant that were involved in the trial, on the specific cases, we agreed to permit them as low impact activities. So in table 1.1 of site permits, they were given the 4.2 activity, but they had to keep within the low impact criteria, which for those of you who don't know, is in application form B2. And it limits things to water use and electrical use. So there's quite a stringent criteria that has to be followed for those to meet the low impact criteria. What we did for the trials is we had one which was imported hydrogen as a gas. and then the other 3 were production of hydrogen in situ. So the import of hydrogen, the main things that we were looking into were coma thresholds. So if the gas is to be stored, then obviously that adds to the coma inventory. So if there are any other coma inventory materials on site, then it does aggregate up. And then for the activities where they're actually producing the hydrogen, we had 2 that were by the electrolysis means, and then 1 was by a plasma torch. And they've provided some information. We've got information on how they went and some of the challenges. The thing that's probably worth me talking about here is, so for the sites that have got low impact criteria in their permits and have got the 4.2 activity, they paid a limited fee for those low impact applications for £3,000. Whereas if they had paid the full 4.2 listed activity charge, it would have been around £13,000. So that was partly why we did limit them. But for any of those that want to go above that criteria, they would have to apply for a variation, and we think that would be substantial variation with a cost of around £11,000 for the substantial variation of the 4.2 activity, which then takes it up similar to what you would have paid had it been a full application activity, not just low impact. Okay, so in terms of other sectors, not just cement and lime, we have received quite a few applications now for production of hydrogen. I think when I checked about a week or 2 ago, it was around 28, but it's probably around that number, not definite. But typically they tend to be applications for things like refueling activities, electrolysis plants, and we've also had 1 blue hydrogen application, which I think we've determined, but we've not seen many of those. It tends to be the certainly in this sector, the green hydrogen by the production of electrolysis method. So when they were applying for the low impact criteria, we didn't have the guidance on emerging techniques, but that's now available. So for any sites that are applying, then yes, we would want you to follow and apply under the guidance for emerging techniques. And that would apply as well if they are varying from the low impact type of permits to the full scale 4.2 activity. And just to mention, also on this call today, we've got Francesco Di Stefano, who's my colleague in MPS, and he's a lead on hydrogen. So we are working quite closely with Jane Dearling, who presented earlier, just to make sure we keep a track on the types of applications that we're getting through, and also what's in the applications. So we tend to be duly making and following the guidance on emerging techniques, and we have had to, in a number of instances, require additional information, and in one case return an application because it's not followed the guidance on emerging techniques. So we would like you all to try and follow that, but by all means, the best thing is to engage in enhanced pre-application discussions with the agency, and we can go through any site-specific requirements during those discussions. So I've just put in here, this next slide, just some of the key considerations that I've taken from the GET, but also from my experience of when we did some of the trials. So in terms of applications, what do we want to see? We want to see some form of technique selection to show that you've considered alternatives and why you propose the technique that you're selecting as being effectively the best one for that specific location and operation. We also want to make sure that you are still minimising your emissions to air or reducing them where that's not possible, including flaring, venting. Obviously, you still need to comply with ELVs that are in your existing permit and any BAT-C requirements for the cement, lime and mineral sector. In terms of water demand, treatment and reuse, at the moment, I don't think for the low impact ones we saw too much in terms of water treatment, But for certainly some of the larger applications that we expect will be coming through, there will be a need for feed water treatment. And where there is a disposal requirement for anything that comes out of that treatment process, and it's a direct discharge, then there will also be introduced to the common wastewater breath. So there will be an additional requirement for those sites that do fall with under that. So they probably will get a similar set of BAT AELs. And obviously, other aspects to consider: noise, odour, and anything that you would normally do in your typical impact assessments for these types of applications. And together with monitoring, with the requirements to certainly measure hydrogen or any hydrogen that might be vented. Excuse me. And obviously, due to the nature of the hydrogen, also accidents and emergency procedures is something that we will focus quite heavily on and require that HAZOPs and LDAR are covered within applications. One thing that's worth me talking about here, at the moment, most of the hydrogen trials that were done in the sector were done by the operators that hold the permits. But for other applications in other sectors, and possibly something that will happen in this sector, is you might get a different operator wishing to run the hydrogen production plant. And for those, it's likely that they'll become multiple operator installations. And some of the cement permits in the sector already are multiple operator installations, and it might mean that they have additional operators as part of their installation. But the main message is that when you are a multiple operator installation, that you need to apply 2 permits at the same time. So the operator of the hydrogen plant would have to make an application at the same time as a variation to the actual operator of the permit that is at the installation currently. And then something which I think will be talked about probably in more detail when we talk about carbon capture. There's also a requirement for disclosure. We've seen quite a few requests for confidentiality, and we can determine those on site-specific cases. But certainly for substances are likely to be emitted to the environment, we have to disclose those, so we aren't able to treat them as confidential. So just something for people to be aware of. So in the cement and lime sector, and obviously some of the trials that have taken place, we've looked at some of the trends, but some of the key issues that we think in terms of use of the hydrogen that we need to do some more work on, it certainly is the ELVs, and I think Richard's going to talk about that shortly in a bit more detail. But for the lime sector, that typically you're using natural gas, then we expect it'll either be dual firing or potentially 100% hydrogen. And obviously they'll need to check that the current BAT ELs for lime sector are still achievable. There could be some increases in NOx. I think that was something that we are aware of and we know about, and that was something that was presented in some of the trials. But obviously that's something that we need to consider and make sure that the current AELs can still be achieved for the cement, lime and minerals breath. But we will talk about some of the ELVs shortly. And then for the cement sector, it's slightly different because they're likely to use a range of other fuels and biomass fuels alongside the use of hydrogen. So in terms of calculating whether or not the NOx is going to have an impact on current ELVs and whether or not any of the other BAT ELs can be still achieved, that's something that we are currently looking into. So it's probably something that might be questioned, I expect, from many of you at the end of this presentation. And just to say, for some sites where you think that you may have an increase in NOx, just to be aware that you also need to consider the impacts. So it's not just complying with the BAT AELs. Some of the sites that we do have in the peak districts, for example, are quite sensitive for local habitat sites. So it might be that we can't increase the NOx for that purpose. So there could be a requirement for additional abatement, such as SCR, if you're already using SNCR. Okay, and then Richard, I think you were going to hopefully you've got some time before 2 o'clock. If you want to take over, and then we can return back to the presentation if there's any other questions.
Yeah, thanks. I can actually stay a bit longer now. My other meeting has been cancelled, so I can stay on a bit longer. So if you want to take questions first, I'm quite happy to wait. Up to you. Or do you want me to go?
I'm happy to take questions now if that's okay then.
Are there any questions for Mark? Okay, I think we'll continue with you, Richard, and then if anybody thinks of anything, we can have another slot at the end. Thank you. The end of the hydrogen bit.
Right. Okie dokie. Well, thank you. I've got a minor issue in that the dog is trying to get into my shed, so there may be some extraneous noises supposed to be inside. Hopefully you can see my screen and you see that introductory slide.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And can you see the little laser pointer that's whizzing around?
Yep.
Excellent. All the technology is going well so far. Paul has his hand up, I see.
Oh, I don't see any hands actually.
Oh, it's gone now. Okay. Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity to come and talk to you about the environmental regulation of the combustion of hydrogen. We've had quite a lot of about the production of hydrogen. The other side to it, of course, is that once you've made your hydrogen, what are you going to do with it? Well, one option is to burn it. So we have been working on producing some guidance for the regulation of hydrogen. So this presentation was originally put together when we were proposing how we were going to go about it. So there's a reasonable amount of detail about current emission limit values, etc. in it. I don't intend going through them, but I thought I would leave it in the slide pack in case anybody's interested, and so that the slide pack is available. If I could get this slide to move on. Why won't it move? There we go. Okay, so we've been working with the other regulators. We're the Environment Agency for England. We've been working with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, National Resources Wales, and Northern Ireland Environment Agency to produce this guidance, and we've come to a common position. We've also been talking to DEFRA and other devolved administrations, and we've produced this guidance through, we've set up a technical working group. John spoke earlier about the GET process, and this is guidance for emerging techniques. So we formed the technical working group, which met in February and March. No, was it January and March? We didn't have much time to do this, although we had been thinking about this for some time. And that technical working group was made up of the other regulators, DEFRA, industry, OEMs, academia, trade associations, all in the combustion sector, or primarily in the combustion sector. It included burner manufacturers, boiler manufacturers, and manufacturers of gas turbines, etc. We've also spoken to AMPs, the engines people. And the current status is that this has to go to our IPC regulators group. We have finished drafting the guidance. It's now awaiting approval within the agency with the aim to get it published on gov.uk in the near future. Once it's been approved, it will be available. It might not be published immediately because there is a process that needs to go through. In the combustion sector, there are several emission limit values out there. You've got the best available technique reference document, which sets BAT. You've got also the minimum standards, which are set in Annex 5 of the Industrial Emissions Directive. Now, these came from the old Large Combustion Plant Directive, so it's relatively rare to have two sets of standards for a sector. But because the way the IED was produced as the Large Combustion Plant Directive was shoehorned into it effectively, we ended up with two sets of emission limit values. And in general, the Annex 5 IED ELVs are less stringent than BREF. We consider them to be minimum standards. So whilst you can derogate from BAT, you cannot derogate from the minimum standards in Annex 5. They're the stop, the buffer. There's also the Medium Combustion Plant Directive, which sets emission limit values for smaller plant. Note that BAT doesn't apply to medium combustion plants, so we'll come back to that, or standalone medium combustion plant. And as I've said, BAT is normally more stringent. The problem we had is that none of these bits of legislation take account of hydrogen. Because apart from in the refinery sector and possibly some specialised sectors, hydrogen hasn't been burnt at large scale, and we have no emission limit values. I was involved with the production of the LCP BREF. I went through the process from start to finish, and I know for a fact that hydrogen was not considered. Any reference to other gases referred to tail gases, gases from the chemical sector, etc. They weren't, it wasn't hydrogen. So that means there's a gap in the legislation, that there may be mention of other gases, but they're not appropriate for hydrogen because hydrogen wasn't available at the time that the legislation was written, or the BREF was written. So we've got to come up with some. However, normally when we develop BAT, you look at what is deployed on the ground and you then assess what is the best available technique for undertaking your process and what can it achieve. But because hydrogen isn't burnt at any significant scale, there's no data out there. So that's meant that we've had to go down the GET process. And I've mentioned the fact that BAT and GET don't apply to IED. So how are we going to apply that to standalone MCPs? If you've got an MCP on an IED installation, that's fine. We can apply BAT. Excuse me. So I don't intend going through these. These are really here for information for later. This is the Annex 5 IED existing plant ELVs, and you'll see it mentions other gases in certain circumstances, but we don't think that reflects hydrogen. And actually there's a value of 120 there, so I'll remember that and I'll mention that again later. This sets, the IED sets monthly ELVs, and then daily values are 110%, so that NOx value would be 110, 100 as a monthly, 110 as a daily, and 95th percentile of hourly are 200% of that, so that would be 200. That really should say 95th percentile of hourly values over the year. When you get to new plant, there's actually no mention of other gases at all, just says gas. And it doesn't define it as natural gas either. These are the back conclusions for GTs, and these figures are tighter, and you've now got an annual average and a daily average. So we've now got monthly, daily, hourly, 95th percentile. We now have 4 values. There are actually a series of footnotes to this table, which means there are something like 22 different ELVs to apply to gas turbines alone, depending on the size of the plant and the number of hours it operates a year. So these are, as I say, just there for completeness. And again, these are for boilers. So this is just an example of some of the values and how they compare. So for a new gas turbine greater than 50 megawatts thermal, we deal in thermal input in the Environment Agency. A lot of when you talk to industry about capacity, it's normally talking about electrical output, but we're interested in the environmental impact of the combustion plant. So what is the capacity? So we talk about thermal input. So the daily average in the BREF, the value for BAT is between 15 to 40 milligrams per normalized cubic meter. And the IED Annex 5 says 55. The annual average in the BREF is 30 as an upper limit, whereas the long-term average, which is actually a monthly average in the ID, is 50. So this is making the point that the minimum standards are slightly less, are normally less stringent than the BREF. Some of them, the upper value is the same for an existing boiler, for example. This is all relevant. I'll come back to it. So the principle that we have come to in developing this approach is that when you decarbonize, you shouldn't increase the amount of NOx that is produced from a process. There should be no deterioration or no significant deterioration in the NOx production. In other words, by reducing carbon, you shouldn't be allowed to have more NOx. You can't trade one pollutant for another. BAT is retrospective, so we can't develop BAT, we'll have to use GET. And what we are proposing in the medium term, until BAT is available, is to use the minimum standards. So those are the less stringent standards set out for combustion of natural gas. That is our benchmark. And those values will be derived from the IED Annex 5 and the Medium Combustion Plant Directive. But there is another issue in that when you burn hydrogen, when you burn natural gas, you have 1 mole of methane burning requires 2 moles of oxygen, and a mole of gas has a fixed volume. That I think it's 22.4 decimeters cubed at STP. And you produce in your exhaust gas 1 mole of CO2 and 2 moles of water vapor. So 2 volumes of gas go in, 2 volumes of gas come out. When you burn hydrogen, there's no CO2 produced, so you only get the water. So and then, of course, when you measure it at, you correct it as dry, you report against emission limit values as dry, there is no water. What this means is that your flue gas is now more concentrated. There is less volume. There's no CO2 and there's no water. So you are, but your NOx mass, if you are producing the same amount of NOx, becomes more concentrated. The NOx concentration increases, but the NOx mass remains the same. So for a given mass of NOx, the concentration is increased. So that needs to be taken into account when setting emission limit values. This slide I'll come back to. I couldn't decide where to put it, so I put it in the wrong place. So we have calculated that when you use milligrams per normalized meter cubed, you need to increase your emission limit value by a factor of 1.37 when burning 100% hydrogen. Now this factor was agreed with industry, and it's also actually referenced in a European document which we reference in the guidance, but it's temporarily escaped my brain. So it's an agreed factor. And we are proposing that if you have blends, that we, instead of having a dynamic ELV that would change every time the concentration of, the mixture, the proportions changed, we would have wide bands, and we would set the maximum emission limit value for that band for anybody within the band. So if you've got 20%, up to 20% hydrogen in your blend, we would set the ELV for 20%. And we're proposing to use relatively wide bands throughout the scale. Unfortunately, it's a curve, it's not a straight line. And that makes it easier, again, to use this approach of wide bands. There is the option of using milligrams per megajoule. But we have, instead of milligrams per normalized meter cubed, however, for consistency with air quality standards and the fact that we've always done used milligrams per meter cubed, we've decided to stick with the concentration approach as opposed to the milligram per megajoule of energy approach. And that is the same unit that we use for air quality standards, and it's what we use in modelling, air dispersion modelling. So these are the bands that we're proposing using: 0 to 20%, 20 to 50%, 50 to 75, 75 to 90, 90 to 95, 95 to 100. They get a little bit closer towards the end, but what we were trying to do is try and keep the factor relatively consistent, and this is relatively, so these are the proposals that this is what we are proposing in terms of bands. 0 to 20% is the lowest because there is talk of the grid accepting up to 20%, so therefore there needs to be a band that will cope with them. And you'll notice that there's no uplift for 20%. If I can go back to this graph now, what this is showing is the carbon intensity of the of mixtures. So if you have 100% methane, then that is the level, that's how much CO2 you get. So this is relative to that 100% value. So as you get 10% hydrogen in your blend, you'll note that the amount of CO2, this is by volume, by the way, it's only dropped by 1% or 2. You need to get up to about 80% hydrogen before you get a 50% reduction in CO2. So this is saying that if we want to have meaningful reductions in CO2 through a switch to a hydrogen economy, or hydrogen as a fuel, we need to be talking about high levels of hydrogen substitution in the natural gas to make it effective, to get these higher levels of carbon reduction.
Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Can I give you a 5-minute prompt, please?
You certainly can.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much you got left.
No, this is just some examples of what the emission limit values would be for different classes of plant. These are the types of plant that we've got to derive emission limit values for. So these are the values that would be applied at 100% hydrogen. It's not a particularly well labeled table, I'm afraid. That's for existing plant. This is for new plant. So how are we going to apply? I mentioned that there was no BAT being applied to MCPs. So we are talking to DEFRA about coming up with a mechanism of how to do that. I can't go any further at this point, but we are talking to DEFRA and we have agreed an approach. We've had to define 3 types of plant by age. We've had to introduce new. So we've got new and existing plant as defined in IED and MCPs, but we've had to treat new as those that will be permitted from January 2025. And that is after this guidance is come out effectively. So what we're saying is that we're proposing that new and existing plants, so all the plant that's already on the ground as up to the point at which we issue this guidance, if they cannot meet these emission limit values because the technology isn't established yet, then we are proposing that a cost benefit analysis could be undertaken to justify a deviation from these values. So what we're doing is putting as much flexibility into this process as we can. And that is really, these are other issues which I don't intend going into, I've just left them in there. So that's the approach we're taking. That was a very rapid whiz through it. I hope that it made some sense. And if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Any questions?
Right. Well.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. That was really, really detailed and technically useful. Thank you.
Right.
And,
do you still need me, or can I drop out now? I've got plenty to do.
I think, Mark, have you got anything more to talk about? Mark Taylor.
You're on mute, I think.
Sorry, got 2 different mute buttons. No, nothing from me, unless Jane or Francesco have anything to add that I might have missed or not covered.
Jane.
See Jane.
Put hand. Thank you.
Yeah, it was just thanks very much both. That was really, really useful, and hopefully gave people an overview of all the different bits of work we're doing. We are thinking about how we can deal with the plasma torch technology. I know that's something that DESNZ are also proposing to fund, which the cement industry are interested in, I understand. So hopefully you will hear more on that in the future. And the only other thing I was going to say was about regulation of safety. We don't regulate safety to people aspects directly under environmental permitting, but operators need to show that they design, operate and maintain their plant to eliminate or minimize risk of potential for accidents, which may cause harm to the environment or human health. So we are working very closely on net zero aspects with the HSE, and obviously hydrogen is a potentially significant risk. So all of those, but on the other hand, it has been, we know how to handle it. And it's making sure that people who are new to that technology or the use of hydrogen, perhaps such as yourselves, are also aware of all those and taking all the appropriate, using all the appropriate standards and methodologies to eliminate or minimise those risks.
Right.
Thank you. That was all.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Okay, I'll just give a few seconds if anybody else has come up with any questions for hydrogen, and then we can let Richard and Jane disappear off the call if they wish. So, final call for any questions on hydrogen use and regulation.
Obviously, if anybody thinks of something big, we're happy to take them off.
Yeah.
Offline.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, I shall bid you adieu.
Thanks, Richard.
Goodbye.
And thank you,
All right.
Jane. And thank you,
Thanks.
Mark.
I'll head off now. Thank you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm now going to hand over to Tom Glyn-Jones, who's going to talk about his work on environmental capacity. Thanks, Tom.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much, Leonie. Let me just place these slides on presenter mode. So my name's Tom Glyn-Jones, and I work in the climate change and energy team within the Environment Agency. So I also sit in the Environment and Business Directorate, and we're quite a large team, and we are split into two parts. So one part looks at climate change adaptation. So they work on the National Adaptation Plan, work quite closely with DEFRA, DESNZ, and the Climate Change Committee, whilst I sit in a team called the Decarbonisation and Net Zero team. So we're all about climate change mitigation. So we, as has been mentioned by John Barrowclough earlier in the session, we lead on the Enabling UK Net Zero plan from the Environment Agency, also the Methane Action Plan, and of course this project that I want to speak to you about this afternoon, which is the Environmental Capacity in Industrial Clusters project. Quickly, before I do that, a bit more about our team. We hold the remit across the organisation in terms of net zero. So we look at the strategic approach to enabling how the Environment Agency enables UK net zero, how we are a key enabler, and to ensure that we look at how the Environment Agency can ensure a smooth transition to the use of cleaner energy, of course, and to make sure that we are positioning ourselves in the best place possible to prepare ourselves for a significant amount of deployment of low carbon technology, which we've heard about, in particular, hydrogen production, carbon capture. So it really gives you a bit of a brief introduction as to who I am, which team I sit in, and I'll go on to a little bit about why we're covering this piece of work. So this is a 4-year programme of work. It's a project. It started back in 2021. We received some funding from BEIS to carry out this work. We, through our links with BEIS, as now DESNZ, our team looks at influencing policy development, obviously particularly the environmental aspects of policy development and net zero. So clearly that covers the work around carbon capture deployments, as well as looking at government ambitions to transition to cleaner fuels such as hydrogen production. So we, as a project, wanted to look ahead between 2021 through to 2035, and even beyond that, up to 2050, of course, to look at how what are the challenges? Are there any going to be any challenges to the deployment of technology such as hydrogen production, carbon capture? We did focus on those two as part of this work. Of course, the number of green technology, low carbon technology is significantly more extensive than those that I've just named, but we needed to kind of focus on which technologies were likely to be of priority to government going forward through to 2050 to obviously reach government net zero ambitions. So our phase 1 work back in 2021, 6-month, what we called a Pathfinder project, looking at whether environmental aspects could limit, could constrain, could challenge the deployment of various low carbon technology projects within industrial clusters. So we wanted to focus specifically on those hubs of industry and the defined industrial clusters that existed back in 2021, and of course have developed today to include a number of other industrial clusters, but at the time it was the Humber, the Teesside and Hynet over in the northwest. So the Humber we wanted to focus on first as this Pathfinder project and focus on some specific topics that we felt were quite important to look at the very beginning. Locally, our teams in regulated industry across a number of other teams as well were interested in understanding what the demand for water could be. So clearly our focus was going to be on water in the first instance for that Pathfinder project. Water quality, water availability. Wanted to look at what the demand would be for water versus the availability of water in that region. Also looking at what the potential for impact could be on water quality on some quite sensitive ecological receptors within the Humber estuary. So it was a very good first look at those specific topics of water for the Humber to understand where the challenges could be, if there would be any challenges. Following on from the phase 1 Pathfinder project, we realised there was more to do on this. We were just scratching the surface. We wanted to understand a bit more and forecast more around water demand and what the water availability would be in other regions of England, particularly focused on the industrial clusters. So we wanted to kind of repeat the same exercise as we did in the Humber, but look at the T's and kind of complete that East Coast cluster look in our phase 2 work in 2022 that took us to 2023. And we were fortunate enough to get further funding from DESNZ to be able to do that, and fully funded our work. So we were able to expand it and look at other topics that we are interested in, but we knew that government and industry would be interested in too. So not just focusing on water, we wanted to have a look at the aspects of emissions to air as well, and the potential for air quality impacts. Flood risk also took an interest for those locally, so our colleagues locally in Humber from the Environment Agency, but also industry as well. So we were engaging quite closely with a number of industry groups around these topics, water, air quality, and they wanted to know a bit more about flood risk. Flood risk wasn't a topic that we continued into Teesside. I think flood risk as a challenge to the deployment of low carbon technology is a lot more understood, because as opposed to perhaps the topics around water demand versus water quality, water availability, sorry, and in possible impacts on water quality as well. So phase 2 continued our work in Humber, looking at air quality, looked at repeating the topics of water availability, water quality in Teesside. Very much we're dependent here on engaging with industry and other groups as well. So other stakeholder groups, not just industry, the various different sectors across industry, but we also wanted to engage with government departments such as DEFRA and DESNZ. We also wanted to engage with our with other regulators such as the Health and Safety Executive, the UK Health Security Agency, and as well as local authorities as well, speaking with their planning departments and their specific climate change specialists on how well prepared they were to receive applications for new developments that will involve low carbon technology. Speaking directly to industry through trade associations or direct to the developments themselves, the projects themselves, about how well prepared they were, how much information they had already on any challenges that exists around water availability, what their demand would be for water, Had they chosen a specific technology for carbon capture that would be less dependent on water? Had they looked at other methods of sourcing water rather than direct from the environment? What conversations that they had with water companies around the security of supply for water? And clearly, we couldn't do this work without speaking to the water companies themselves and looking at kind of their forward look in their own plans, looking at their water resource management plans, looking at to understand how they'd factored in the additional demand for water from low carbon technology. So that very much kind of focused our attention on our phase 1 and 2 work. So this presentation to you today is around the findings of that work. And we haven't finished. We are working through our phase 3 of the 4-year program, which takes us to 2025. But phase 3 takes us to the end, well, midway through the summer of this year, where we're looking at HyNet in the northwest, and we're repeating the same exercise that we did in Humber and Tees, looking at water in the northwest. We need to compare across the different industrial clusters as to whether water is a area of interest and it could challenge the deployment of low carbon technology, depending on what the demand is across these individual industrial cluster, or is it isolated to one particular industrial cluster where water vulnerability is a particular issue? Now we're midway through the phase 3 work, and we've yet to kind of complete our findings and analyze all of the information that we've gathered from stakeholders. And actually in phase 3 we've been lucky enough to use consultants to help us gather what we're calling kind of an evidence baseline for water availability, water demand, water quality, possible water quality impacts in HyNet Northwest. We haven't finished our air quality study. We'd skimmed the surface of air quality in the Humber. We wanted to look at air quality again in Teesside and do a deeper dive into air quality in Teesside. And our consultants have helped us do that. So we've now finished the evidence gathering exercise in our phase 3 work, and we're analysing all of that information. And we will be drafting some products that we will share externally. We have already begun to do that in our phase 1 and 2 work, where we embarked on quite a lengthy dissemination exercise. We've published that information now to the DESNS pages of gov.uk, and I'll share some links with you a little later on. We have ambitions to do a phase 4. We don't have a great deal of time to do it, but we do need to finish off the air quality study in HyNet to make that comparison across all of the industrial clusters, to check and see whether the same challenges exist with one industrial cluster as another. Why did we start with the Humber and Tees? They are quite large in terms of CO2 contributions to the overall CO2 contributions from industry in the UK. We're also really interested in the Humber and Tees because of the variation in industries. We wanted to understand how each individual sector of industry within these clusters were planning to decarbonise, what their current dependence were on water, what their wastewater arisings were, and obviously going into the future what their plans would be for fuel switching to hydrogen, or indeed capture of carbon and transportation and storage offshore. So we were very, very interested in beginning our work with the Humber and Tees. Of course, at the time, back in 2021, we thought Humber would be the ones to receive government funding early, but that's not been the case. But back in 2021, before the government funding schemes were mature enough, the Humber certainly and the Tees were leading the way, if you like, but of course other industrial clusters are quickly catching up. So bit of a brief phase 1 kind of findings recap. There are a number of other slides that we will share with you after this session, so you can look at them at your leisure and understand them in a bit more detail than I've got time to provide you with now. We know, I don't think it comes as much as a surprise, we're seeing year-on-year reductions in summertime rainfall. That is obviously an issue in terms of industry being able to sustainably abstract the water that they require for their existing processes, let alone the additional processes they will have if they choose to adopt carbon capture, say, for instance, or they're looking to produce their own hydrogen for their own use. So very much water being a key aspect there, and the ability for rainfall to recharge, let's say, groundwater sources. So a number of abstractors within the Humber are dependent on groundwater abstraction as a resource, as well as surface water abstraction, as well as other non-public water supply that they are able to source. So climate impact is an aspect of this work. We are looking at forecasting with the help of the Met Office what the changes are likely to be to rainfall, as well as summertime, wintertime temperatures, in terms of the impacts on water resources. We know that even within an industrial cluster, there are differences between one part of the cluster as opposed to another in terms of water resource zones, in terms of how much water is available. So even within one industrial cluster, there can be a difference in terms of how much water is available depending on where you are. So within the Humber, the south of the Humber Bank is very much looking at vulnerable in terms of water availability, as opposed to the north bank of the Humber, where actually they're in surplus. Whether that remains to be the case, of course, as we go further into this decade, into the next decade, our message to industry is not to be complacent if it looks to be a surplus of water at this stage. Of course, industry are thinking about the security of supply of water throughout the operational lifetime of their newly deployed technology. And of course, it goes without saying, growing population pressures, of course, additional development, which isn't industry fed, is also placing a pressure on water availability, as well as other industries as well, like agriculture, of course, placing a pressure on water availability. Moving through into our phase 2 work, we wanted to kind of make sure that we were getting as up-to-date information as possible from individual stakeholder groups. And that meant going out, carrying out workshops, supplying them with questionnaires, giving them the opportunity to have one-to-one discussions with us. So it was a lengthy stakeholder engagement exercise in phase 2. It was much improved from phase 1, where we just provided a questionnaire, a survey. And we didn't get as much uptake as we would have liked in our phase 1 work. And we think that's probably to do with the fact that in 2021, clearly projects hadn't as developed as far as they had in phase 2. I'll move us on. Environmental challenges then, Humber specific. There are some here that have been listed as being the key challenges as of our phase 2 work, which completed last year, 2023, around June time. We have disseminated much of these findings out to those key stakeholders. Of course, this group that I'm presenting to now, one of those key stakeholders. We've got, as I've mentioned, these products for our phase 1 and phase 2 work ready and available for people to use. And as I've said, I'll provide you with the links later on. Air quality, we're doing a much deeper dive looking at air quality and those aspects of industrial emissions from hydrogen production, carbon capture. Of course, it's looking at the emissions from the solvent capture process, the residual emissions of CO2, the residual emissions from the solvent makeup from the capture process, and what impact that possibly could have. This is a high-level look. So we're not actually modelling emissions at this point in time, but there is a spin-off project that I'll briefly mention at the very end of this presentation, should I have time. I'm going to move us on. Water quality there from those bullet points. You can see there are some specific sensitive receptors, ecological receptors, that are sensitive to wastewater arisings, discharges, and the indirect deposition of pollutants from emissions to air as well. So we obviously took an interest in looking at which sensitive species even within these receptors would potentially could be impacted. And of course, that has a knock-on impact on how these projects are developed and how they get their authorizations as well. What we're trying to do here is inform industry, we're trying to inform government, we're trying to inform other stakeholders of the possible challenges so that they can prepare for them and hopefully reduce the risk of delays to their projects. Let's move on. T's water quality, water availability. As I've said, our phase 2 work repeated the study on waters we did in phase 1 to look at whether the same challenges were true in T's as they are in Humber. Okay, in terms of water availability, it's a different picture. It's a different picture because of the of more water currently being available for industry. Should industry deploy their planned projects that we know of, if they deploy them within the next 5 to 10 years, there is the water available for them to utilize. Now, again, our message to industry, our message to other stakeholders is the complacency can't set in here. Just because water may be available for the next 5 to 10 years doesn't mean to say that water is also going to be available over the next 20 to 25 years. We're, of course, looking as far ahead as 2050. So it's making sure that there is that understanding across the development of these new technologies, that there is that understanding around water availability, security of supply, looking at possible alternative options to securing sufficient water. So that may not be direct from the environment, it may not necessarily come from water companies, but it could involve the reuse of water as well, or looking at other methods, say for instance for cooling purposes. I'm going to move us on. I mentioned already, didn't I, in this project that we were looking at climate impacts. So we did rely heavily on the modelling that's been done by the Met Office, looking at the UK climate projections that take us beyond 2050 up to 2080. So we could look at, we could extrapolate figures from air temperatures and what that would mean for water temperatures. We wanted to look at what impacts a warming environment would have on sensitive receptors around river catchments. Also looking at the possible impacts on abstractions, so low river flows, of course, poor recharge rates for groundwater for industry to utilize the water needed for cooling purposes and processed water makeup purposes, but also looking at cooling water efficiency as well, looking at increases in ambient temperatures. So we were carrying out this kind of forward look, taking us up to 2080 to see what additional impacts could be brought about by climate change on the environmental capacity, essentially what challenges could be brought about by you know, a lack of water in the future, and also additional pressures on sensitive receptors from wastewater discharges. I mentioned a set of products that I'm going to show you links to. We had last year this dissemination exercise across our stakeholder groups and a wider audience, but we really wanted to reach as many people as possible that would be interested in this work, and that's why we went to DESNZ, who are our sponsors, to say, look, can we publish this work on the gov.uk website? Here is an infographic. Now, what you're looking at here is a series of slides that is public facing, it faces industry, it gives them a very brief summary of the findings that we've got around water, flood risk, air quality from the Humber and Tees from both phases 1 and phases 2 of this work. And it talks about the forecasting for lower river flows, forecasting the extremes in temperature, summertime, wintertime, forecasting rates in groundwater recharge, looking at the ambient temperature increases in rivers, knock-on impacts in terms of water abstraction, looking at what we are expecting industry to need in terms of additional water, which is a worst case scenario. So bear that in mind when you look at these reports. Many of the many of the figures are based on worst case scenarios here. It's really to kind of put into perspective what challenge we're facing here in terms of water demand versus water availability. As you can see on the right hand side there from air quality, and this is something that we're focusing on in our phase 3 work in Teesside, is that looking at nitrogen deposition, looking at which of the sensitive habitats, the designated sites, the ecological receptors would be the most susceptible to nitrogen deposition, and certainly factor that into emissions to air and our understanding of the switch to hydrogen fuel, the production of hydrogen, and how that potentially could impact on air quality. So we've got that better understanding. We're able to better inform industry. We can also encourage industry, as Mark mentioned earlier on in this session, to take us up on the offer of the enhanced pre-app work as well. So we get the opportunity to talk to industry about some of these issues. I'll move us on. I've mentioned the infographics here. This is the second slide of our infographic. This is what you'll see when you click on the links on gov.uk, and it shows you some of the facts and figures, a high level look at some of the issues that we've found throughout this study. So this is Tees. This infographic pulls together all of the findings into key messages that we're using to inform government and all of the different industry groups via the trade associations. We've been speaking to the likes of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. We do speak to them frequently. Energy UK, we speak to them frequently also, along with our colleagues in water resources, talking about things like the National Framework for Water Resources and environmental destinations work. And we also speak into the hydrogen trade associations as well, so Hydrogen UK and the Hydrogen Energy Association. And I'm very, very happy to speak to you too at the Mineral Products Association about this work. There is an email address at the bottom of this slide here, which if you have any questions, I would encourage you to drop a question to us at that email address, and we'll do our very best to provide a response to you. Just very quickly, if I've got time, Leonie, I've mentioned a spin-off project. It's about to begin. It's looking at the cumulative impact assessments of industrial emissions to air from obviously hydrogen production and carbon capture. It's going to focus on Teesside, so we'll use some case studies there. It does look at modelling work of emissions to air. That's very new, but this has already been completed. This digital twin project was a piece of work that we embarked on last year using funding from the Regulators Pioneer Fund, where we wanted to develop a proof of concept, a digital twin, a dynamic model of a industrial cluster. So we focused on the Humber. It's far too large to deliver a digital twin dynamic model encompassing all of the industry across the industrial cluster and all of their emissions to water. It's just focused on emissions to water. So we kind of narrowed it down to a number of projects within that Humber industrial cluster. We've completed that area, that piece of work now. We've proved as a proof of concept it can work with more development. We can understand by utilising the dynamic model what potential impacts there may be from various different technology types on the receiving watercourse, and also focusing on the demand these technologies have on water as a resource as well. So please go and have a look at that if you get a chance. Next steps for us, phase 3, we're coming to the end of it. We're analysing all of the evidence. We're going to create some products again, similar to what we've done in phase 1 and phase 2. They will be available shortly on gov.uk. We are planning a phase 4, but it's not going to be quite as broad as we had hoped it would be. It's going to continue the look at air quality in HyNet, but we've also got to do a bit of a comparison across all of the industrial clusters on the findings that we've had. I think that comes to the end of my presentation. A couple of links there to the documents, the products that I've just mentioned. Go and have a look at those if you have time, and drop me a line or any of the team from the Environmental Capacity and Industrial Clusters project on the Enabling Net Zero email address. I'll pop that into the chat at the very end. Thanks, Leonie.
Great, thank you ever so much, Tom, for the, giving us the overview of that work that's gone on. Are there any immediate questions on that? There'll hopefully be opportunity just towards the end as well. But I think it shows you the or gives you an idea of the sort of constraints that there may be and the planning that needs to go into sort of cluster work, and how collaboration I think is really important. And I thought this was a really important message to bring to this talk today. So thank you, Tom. Right, we are going to have a quick break. We're going to have 5 minutes now. I think if we could be back at just before sort of like 47, so just after 10 to, and we'll aim to kick off at about 14:52, if that's all right. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit precise here. And we're going to kick off with the ETS talk, emission trading scheme, which is a fairly short break. So quick comfort break, and then we'll be back in a few minutes. Great, thank you for your patience.
Leonie, can I ask
Hi,
a
Doug.
question?
Yes.
I just got slung out. Zscaler said something about captive portal detected and threw me out. I presume we're on a break at the moment.
We are, but I think it's still being recorded. You can always
Yeah.
do it via chat if you prefer to.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right, I think we'll ready to go. I hope most people are back. We've just slightly tweaked the running order, and we're going to do session 5 now, which is the implications for the UK emissions trading scheme. And I'm very pleased to welcome Joan Forteith and George McLennan. I'll let you both introduce yourselves, and they're going to give us quite a short presentation. It's due to be short on ETS. Thank you, Joan, and thank you, George.
Sure, if you can get off your mute button. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to today's session. It's really good that we're able to join looking at the decarbonisation issues. So my name is Joan Forteith, and I work in environment and business along with several other speakers you've heard from today already. And I'm here with George McLennan, sorry, can't even pronounce your name, George, who also works in emissions trading in our operational directorate. So we'll run through, we'll go into the next one, George. We'll go through some issues about UK ETS, but before we do that, I wanted to take this opportunity to outline the other work that we're involved with in our area of the Environment Agency. I think John mentioned the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. Excuse me, but we're also involved with climate change agreements, the fluorinated gases, and the recently introduced clean heat market mechanism. So if you are involved with any of these or have any questions or concerns, we've got an email address at the end of this presentation, so please do get in touch. But if we can go into the next one, what we wanted to run through, as Leonie says, a quick introduction to what is the UK emissions trading scheme and how decarbonisation will hopefully benefit your participation and your cost within being in the emissions trading scheme. So we'll look at what it is. Excuse me, and then I'll hand you over to George, who'll be able to give more detail on energy efficiency and how the ways of decarbonisation in the scheme and how we would look at that in permitting. Excuse me. So if we go on to the next one, please, George. Thank you. So quite a few of you might already be familiar with the emissions trading scheme. It was in the UK, we piloted, trialled it, ran it. It then became a European scheme, and now we have our own scheme again. There is also the EU scheme, and there are some differences between the two schemes now. It's fundamentally a cap and trade scheme to allow us to decarbonise, essentially. It's one of the flagship pieces of legislation from government. Having this overall cap limits the amount of emissions that are able to be recuperated, and that cap reduces over time and is aligned with the government's net zero plans, and that will go into legislation from next year. And to try and address the cost of the emissions trading scheme and the need to decarbonise, the government has continued with the carbon leakage scheme, which allows the provision of free allocation of allowances for certain industries if you meet the particular eligibility for that. And how we are permitting this, if you're of a particular industrial activity, it's most commonly we permit for combustion of fuels and electricity generation, but there are other activities as well that are specified within the order, along with aviation. And how we look for compliance with that scheme, with the scheme, is there are two permitting approaches: a simplified one for hospital and small emitters, and the full scheme for the bigger producers, the greenhouse gas permit holders. Everyone is required to monitor their emissions and report annually. It's a calendar year, January to December, and they must report their verified emissions if they're in the full scheme. They have the choice to verify or self-verify for the simplified scheme. And we've just run through that, so thank you very much if you're one of the ones that were able to get your emissions report to us by the deadline of the end of March. You then would, by the end of April, have to surrender allowances that equal the emissions that you reported at the end of March. So that's all of the emissions that you have emitted, all your greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide equivalent, that you'd have to submit surrender allowances for that. You can buy them on the auction, or on a secondary market through trading. But again, you might be eligible to a certain amount of free allowances. If you are eligible, then you must also have do additional reporting, which is of your activity level, which again is annual. And again, we report that in March, and again, that must be verified. There are different checks that we do. Your first one is through the verification process. As I say, you would engage with your verifier earlier on in the reporting process, and then also the regulator would check your submission, and any changes or improvements that need made would be flagged. Although we've got Environment Agency on this slide, this process is the exact same throughout the whole of the UK. And I think the next slide shows the, so here we have the reductions of emissions that are attributable to this piece of legislation. 2013 was the start of the final phase that we were in the EU scheme for, phase 3, and then in 2020 we started in the UK ETS, and there is a bit of unusual behaviour in those last 3 years, and that is related to COVID. And as I said, thank you very much. We had a really good success rate for the submissions of reports at the end of March, but unfortunately it's just too quick to have properly analysed and looked at the data to bring this into this slide, so we'll do that in due course. So now we can move on to George, who's going to take you through the energy efficiency slides. Thank you.
So with energy efficiency, it should result in our operators reducing their CO2 emissions to atmosphere over time, which will then in turn reduce their liabilities under the ETS for our full scheme participants. So it would reduce the amount of allowances that you need to purchase and surrender in April. And for our hospital and small emitter sites, it would reduce the target exceedance penalties that you'll be liable for. And with that, if you do come under your emissions target, you can bank the excess target for the following year. Energy efficiency improvements can also affect the amount of free allocation that you're entitled to if you are a full scheme member and have a fallback sub-installation. So that is either a heat benchmark or a fuel one. And the way that you would demonstrate your energy efficiency improvements is through your annual activity level report in tab G. So you would need to provide information on your terajoules per product, and that's split out at ProgCom code level, which would then demonstrate any decreases in your activity level that was due to energy efficiency measures that you've put in place. So if your reduction in activity level triggered the activity level change of 15%, and you could demonstrate that that reduction didn't result in, it was a result of energy efficiency measures, but your production levels had stayed the same for whatever you're producing, then you may be entitled to keep that allocation. So under the ETS, there are multiple ways for decarbonisation. So through optimizing your process, becoming more energy efficient, changing the raw materials that you're using, fuel switching, and then carbon capture and storage. What your regulated activity, depending on what regulated activity you fall under, will dictate what sort of emissions that you're required to report to us. So if you are under the cement clinker regulated activity, you'll be required to both report your combustion of fuel emissions plus your process emissions. So that'll give you multiple avenues for decarbonisation. There are fuel switching, so switching from fossil to biomass or to mixed fuels. And then we've also got fuel switching to hydrogen. This is still a developing policy area in ETS. So if you are thinking of trialing fuel switching to hydrogen, please get in contact with us so we can talk this through with you. For biomass, whether that's solid, gaseous or liquid, for non-energy purposes, you can zero rate your emissions factor for the fraction of biomass. So that is still reported to us, but it's not included within your overall reportable emissions that you have to surrender for. For bioliquids, where the purpose of the combustion is for energy, so most commonly electricity and heating, to zero rate that, you'll have to provide evidence to your verifier that it meets the sustainability criteria. So this would be, for example, a proof of sustainability certificate that covers each batch of bioliquids that you have used within the year. This is to encourage operators to use more sustainable fuels and reduce pure fossil fuel use. Government did consult on introducing new sustainability criteria for all biomass fuels under the UK ETS, and that was in the Develop the UK ETS consultation. DESNZ have also published their biomass strategy, and this is looking at developing a cross-sectoral common sustainability framework. So this means that the same sustainability criteria would apply across multiple regulations rather than the situation that we have now, where it varies quite significantly. And any changes to the sustainability criteria for biomass would be further consulted on. Just to mention that the sustainability criteria for the hospital and small emitter scheme, they don't have to provide proof of the sustainability criteria. They can zero rate their bioliquid use without it. We're also looking at carbon capture and storage and how the UK ETS can incentivise and facilitate the rollout of CCS. CCS forms 3 different regulated activities in the UK order. So there is one for capture of CO2 from other installations, there is the transport of CO2 for geological storage, and then the geological storage of CO2. If an installation is capturing their CO2 and sending that to geological storage, they can deduct that amount from their reportable emissions. There are specific monitoring requirements for catch, transport and storage. That is outlined in Annex 4 of the MRR. For the transfer of CO2 between installations, that must be based on a measurement-based methodology. So for calculating the emissions of installations, they can use a calculation-based methodology. DESNZ is due to consult this year to include non-pipeline transfers of CO2 and intermediate storage, because the regulations currently only allow CO2 transport by pipeline, which is going to present a significant hurdle for dispersed industries that are outside of clusters. So with the potential inclusion of alternate forms of CO2 transfer, such as road, rail and shipping, this will enable dispersed industries to tap into the industrial cluster infrastructure for the initially for HyNet and Net Zero Teesside. And it's just a quick visual of a transport network that would be covered. Each part of this is covered by the UK ETS. We've got a list of published guidance on our .gov website, covering various aspects of the UK ETS. And if you've got any further questions, you can contact us at the email on screen. And we're free to take any questions now.
So any questions from anyone? But obviously answered everything. Can I ask a question as somebody who doesn't really know much about ETS? So what about utilisation? If somebody was capturing CO2 for utilisation, are they allowed to? They don't have to count those emissions then?
The Article 49 only covers for CO2 capture for utilisation for when you're transferring CO2 out of your installation for the production of precipitated calcium carbonate. And that's the current utilisation options under the UK ETS at the moment.
Okay, so if somebody wanted to do it in order to have it utilised somewhere else, I don't know, food and drink production or whatever, then that's not covered then yet.
The emissions would be classed as emitted.
Oh right, okay. Yeah. I see Mike Haynes has got his hand up as well. Thanks, George.
Yeah, thanks, George. Mike Haynes, MPA Lime. Just interested in the view on carbonation of products. So lime and cement go into products which can and do carbonate, and the opportunity for that to be a means of reducing our emissions numbers. Just wondered what your views are on that.
So with the current rules for transfers of CO2 between installations. There are, I think it's Article 48 and Article 49. So an installation can deduct from their emissions the CO2 for CCS, and it is specified as sending to geological storage or for the production of precipitate calcium carbonate. Policy side, I think that's more of a DESNES question, whether they are looking at other forms of CO2 utilisation, but at the moment, those are just the options that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Great. Well, thank you, Joan, and thank you, George. Thank you for coming along and talking to us today. We've now got our final talk on the permitting of carbon capture and other novel technologies. So I'll hand over to Gwenda and Miriam, and thank you very much for you two waiting very patiently to give last. And I know there's some really interesting stuff in this presentation because they went through it with me yesterday. So thank you.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. So I'll just introduce myself and Gwenda first. So I am Miriam Townsend. I'm a senior permitting officer in the National Permitting Service, and myself and Gwenda are both the co-leads for the industrial decarbonisation. So I will now just share my screen. Gwenda, if you want to say anything more, or
no, that's fine. Thanks, Miriam.
it's not seem to. Where is it? Okay. Right, hopefully everyone can see that okay, and thank you everybody for coming today. Gwenda and myself will just run through sort of the permitting aspects of carbon capture. Most of our presentation will focus on, well, all of it really will focus on capture using amines, because that is the kind of applications that we've received to date. And some other presenters have also talked a little bit about some of the things that we've covered. So apologies if we're going over things that have already been said, but hopefully we'll remember and not go over things in too much detail. So what we are going to cover today is kind of a range of topics relating to the permitting of carbon capture. We will look at what the activity is that carbon capture is regulated under. We'll look at regulating R&D trials, looking a bit about pre-app, and then in the sections on application requirements and preparing applications, we'll look at a range of different topics such as charging, commercial confidentiality, staged applications, and multi-operator installations, which some of these things have been touched on already. And we'll also look at the list of documents and assessments we'd expect to see in an application. And then finally, we will talk through some common issues we have encountered with our current carbon capture applications and how these can be avoided. After each section, we will pause for any questions. I think there's going to be 3 opportunities to ask questions. In these slides, we've used some terminology and some acronyms. So I've just put a slide together here with just explaining what they are so that it's for clarity and for future reference, so that we all know we're talking about the same things. So first of all, we're just going to talk about what we do and don't regulate, which I think John already touched upon. So we regulate carbon capture as an installation under section 6.10 of Schedule 1 of Part 2 of the Environmental Permitting Regulations. If you look at on the slide here, you can see it gives an explanation of what that is, but the key words to remember in the description are from an installation and geological storage. And these are key to determining what we regulate and what we don't. And of course, we all know the permanent geological storage refers to the CO2 being pumped into spent oil and gas wells, such as those in the North Sea. And for permitting purposes, unlike for ETS, we are not the regulator of this offshore storage. So what we do regulate are those which are installation, excuse me, we regulate activities as an installation under section 6.10, where the carbon dioxide is captured from the emissions from an installation and where the captured CO2 is for permanent geological storage. Where CO2 is captured from an installation activity, but it is for use, and as Leonie mentioned, often it's used in the food and drink industry, the capture plant would be permitted as a directly associated activity rather than a separate listed activity itself. But then if we've got the example that that John gave earlier of a medium combustion plant where it's not coming from an installation and it's not going, whether it's going for use or geological storage, then we wouldn't regulate that. And another example of that would be direct air capture. So obviously that involves the capture of CO2 in the atmosphere, and as that is not, CO2 is not come from a specific installation, and we would not then regulate that as an EPR activity. So I'm just going to hand over to Gwenda, who's just going to talk you through regulation for trials and R&D.
Thank you, Miriam. So we don't regulate standalone research and development plant or testing of new products or processes where the installation or plant is used solely for these purposes. It's used solely for research and development or solely for new products or process testing. We don't regulate these. We don't regulate these types of activities unless they're related to waste incineration or co-incineration activities. And the more details on this, you need to look at paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 1 of the Environmental and Permitting Regs 2016. We therefore don't regulate trials on existing permitted installations where there is no technical connection between the trial process or pilot plant and the permitted activities, again, unless the activities relate to waste incineration or co-incineration. So if you're proposing trials of carbon capture or other novel technologies on your permitted cement or lime installation, therefore, you will actually most likely require our approval to run the trial. This is because you're most likely going to have a technical connection because you're looking at taking emissions from your process or from your combustion plant, supporting your process and actually treating those emissions in the pilot plant or in your trial, or you will actually be operating a waste co-incineration plant, particularly for the cement activities. So you would be, you wouldn't have this get out on being regulated for your research and development and your trials. Good news is that you don't have to have a separate permit for this, but you will need our approval if you have an existing permit, that is, but you will need our approval either as a change to your operations on your existing permit or as a variation to your permit activities. We give more details of this and explain what you need to submit in our guidance, and the link's provided on the slide. Once you've reviewed our guidance, you should discuss your proposals with your area regulatory compliance officer and agree if the trial can be approved under your existing permit, and the officer can take you through what that's required, what constraints there are on doing that. They may recommend that you have to put in for a variation to your permit before you can operate your trial. But if there's any uncertainty about this as to whether you need to vary your permit or not, you should seek advice from us using our enhanced pre-application advice service, which will be mentioned a bit later in this talk, as we mentioned before today. And there'll be a link to that later in the talk. You need to be prepared that you're going to have to provide us with information relating to the proposed emissions and their impacts from your trial. And this is even if parts of the process or the solvent itself is subject to commercial confidentiality. So be aware of that we need this information because we need to be able to check that the impacts from your proposed activity or proposed trial are likely to be insignificant. Thanks, Miriam. Can I have the next slide? Actually, do we have any questions just before we move on research and development permitting? Nope. Okay, we can catch up. We can have questions later as well. So moving on just want to briefly talk about engagement and pre-application. Just to say that we really strongly recommend that you talk to us as early as you can about your processes, whether that's initial engagements with environment and business sector leads or with your area regulator, and that you apply for enhanced pre-application advice before you put in your application for your carbon capture activity. This will ensure that you get the most up-to-date guidance and specific advice relevant to your proposals. This is also an opportunity to discuss how the guidance applies in your specific circumstances. You should request advice early in the process, as early as you can. You'll be charged for this. It's charged at £100 per hour plus VAT, but that we would provide a cost estimate in advance for your agreement before any work is carried out. Our sector specialists from permitting and environment and business are likely to attend, and you can also request that your area compliance officer attends. I'm going to hand back to Miriam now just to run through the application process and topics required related to different aspects of a permit application.
Right, thank you, Gwenda. So I've set out here just our permitting process, and hopefully most of you will be familiar with it. So I'm just going to run through the sort of different points. The application process for carbon capture is the same as that for all other applications. Once the application is submitted, the permitting support officer will carry out the admin checks, including the fee is being paid, and then it's allocated to a permitting officer, and they will carry out duly making checks and request any missing information. After duly making, if there is a claim for commercial confidentiality, it will be determined before the application goes on consultation. The application will be assessed and the modelling audited, and if any further information or clarification is required, this will be done via information notices under Schedule 5 of EPR. Once our technical assessment is complete and we decide to grant the permit, a draft permit will be sent to the operator for review, after which the permit will be issued and the permit and decision document will be published. For sites of high public interest, it's very similar, but the additional steps are that we will have an engagement plan, and this which we will discuss with our area colleagues, and any additional engagement will take place during the consultation period. Once we've completed the termination, we will then publish our draft decision if we're going to issue for a further period of consultation, and then after that the permit is issued and the decision document and the permit will be published. The process of staged application is slightly different to that of other applications, so there's a little bit more to it, mainly just for before the duly making step. We will only agree to an application being staged for novel or complex activities. Carbon capture would be considered to be both novel and complex. Where an applicant has not yet finalised all their proposals, submitting the application in stages can be useful as the application process is commenced, and then when you finalise your information it can be submitted at a later date. In addition, you will get feedback on what information is still required at each stage. Staged application means that the application documents are submitted in stages. The applicant requires our agreement to do this. If you're proposing to use this process, then you should discuss this during your pre-application, and we can then agree or disagree that it can or cannot be submitted in stages. When the application is submitted, the first stage application should include a timetable for each stage and a plan of what information will be submitted at each stage, and we will need to agree to this. Any changes to the timetable need to be agreed with us, and if the agreed timetable is not followed, we could stop work on the application. We will review the information submitted at each stage and ask for any missing information or clarification. This won't be a full determination. It will be equivalent to doing a duly making check. Only when we have all the information will we duly make the application. The application will be charged on a time and materials basis, and I'll provide you a bit more information about the charging later on. But it's important to note that failure to pay these invoices promptly could mean we stop doing any further work on the application. And you will also have to pay the additional standard charges for the habitats assessment or assessment of a noise management plan. We have some guidance which is published not that long ago, and there's a link here on the slide. We recommend that you read this guidance if you think you may want to submit your application in stages. And it's worth just saying that you should remember that submitting a staged application means that the application is submitted in stages and not that it is determined in stages. So for application charges, it depends on whether the carbon capture plant is included in an application for a new activity or whether it is being retrofitted. The charge also depends on whether the captured carbon is to be used or is destined for geological storage. For applications to retrofit, where carbon capture is for storage, the application charge is for a new 6.10 activity, and you may also have to pay a variation charge for changes to the existing activity, depending on the level of additional assessment required. For carbon capture for use, the application charge is a substantial variation to the existing activity to add the carbon capture activity as a directly associated activity. I apologise, there's many uses of the word activity there, so hopefully it's still clear. In addition to the application charge, you will also have to pay other charges in relation to assessment of plans. These include for habitats and noise where they are relevant. In addition, for sites of high public interest, you will also have to pay the advertisement fee of £500 to cover the cost of the advertising of the consultation in a local newspaper. So for staged applications, we don't have a set application charge, but rather they, as I said, they are charged as time and materials for the whole determination. We will send an estimate to you of the time we will take on the application in the forthcoming month. You will be sent invoices each month and you're expected to pay these promptly. If they're not paid, we could decide not to do any further work, and we will definitely not duly make the application once we've received all stages if the invoices have not been paid, but we will send you reminders about this. You will also have to pay the extra charges for assessment of plans and for the advert where applicable, so if it is also a site of high public interest. If the application is a site of high public interest, which is not a staged application, you will pay the set application fee as shown in the previous slide, and then pay time and materials once that fee is spent. You will also pay the advert fee and the assessment of plans fees that are relevant. So I recommend that you have a look at our guidance, and we've provided the links here, and look at the table of charges for the exact numerical values for the charges. So at the moment, our queue times are improving, but you should still take account of that when making your application. And we do recommend you think of at least 12 months. You can request prioritisation, which you should do when the application is made. And we do consider the final investment deadline when making a decision regarding prioritisation. Prioritisation does not always mean we start work on the application straight away, but rather that the application will go to the top of the queue and will be picked up when a permitting officer with the relevant skills has capacity. We are aware of the funding deadlines and that these may be very tight. Therefore, you should endeavour to apply as soon as you can. If you wish to claim commercial or industrial confidentiality on any aspect of the application, you must provide justification. You must ensure that the part of the application to which the claim relates is separate from the rest of the application, and that there is a full version for us to work from and a redacted version for the public register. You must disclose the names of the solvents to us, irrespective of whether you claim confidentiality on these, as we need to know what the solvents are so that we can review the emissions included in the air impact assessment. We cannot accept a claim for confidentiality relating to emissions. Therefore, you will have to assume that the solvents and their breakdown products in the absorber and abatement columns will be emitted and that these will need to be disclosed. The only exception is if you have evidence from relevant pilot studies that demonstrates that some pollutants are not emitted. You must make the claim, the operator must make the claim, and not the supplier of the proprietary solvent, if that is what you're using. This information is relevant to applications made under environmental permitting regulations. There are also separate requirements for disclosure under the Freedom of Information and Environmental Information Regs. So if we receive a Freedom of Information request, we must disclose that information. We must disclose the information we hold at the time of the request, unless it meets the exemptions within that legislation. And again, information relating to emissions is not exempted from disclosure. Therefore, you will need to consider how you present any proprietary solvent information to us if you're intending for it to be confidential. For example, separating the solvent composition information from the emissions information. We have already dealt with a Freedom of Information request for an application for a carbon capture plant that we are dealing with at the moment. And it took because there was a claim for commercial confidentiality on the solvent, there was actually quite a delay in us commencing determination of that application under the environmental permitting regs because of the time it took us to sort out that Freedom of Information request. Mainly because of the way it was presented and that it was commercially confidential. So if you think that if you have a site of high public interest, or you've considered that the public may be interested in that particular site, and therefore there could be a request for under the Freedom of Information, Environmental Information Regulations, it's probably a good idea to talk about that at your pre-app, and then we could advise you about how you could best present that information so it doesn't cause problems. Mark already spoke a little bit about multi-operator installations. So if you're intending for the carbon capture plant to be operated by a third party, then we will need the new bespoke application for the carbon capture plant and an application to vary the permit for the activity producing the carbon at the same time. Consideration needs to be made about when the responsibility for the flue gases changes hands and what changes are required to the permit producing the carbon as a result of adding the carbon capture plant. You should also note that the permit producing the carbon still has to comply with the relevant BAT for the activity, including the BAT AELs and energy efficiency limits. Any assessments provided, such as for noise, and air quality, must take account of the installation as a whole, so both the carbon capture plant emissions and the emissions from the activity producing the carbon. The variation charge will depend on the degree of assessment required, so that's the variation for the existing permit for the activity producing the carbon. For example, if the addition of the carbon capture plant results in changes to the emissions of the cement lime plant, you will need to submit new emissions assessments, and that will be a normal variation charge. So it's quite a lot of detail there. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Sorry, Tom, we can't really hear what you were saying. Yeah.
Sorry, there's someone else in the background of my office. Yeah. So I'm from Agri Industries. I'm carbon capture project manager here. I'm just wondering if, I think you maybe referred to it earlier, but whether you've had any kind of successful applications for proprietary solvents, or whether all kind of permits have been done on just with monoethylamine so far.
I think most of the applications we've had are on MEA, but we correct me if I'm wrong, Gwenda, but we have issued a permit. Have one with proprietary solvents. Yeah,
we have issued a permit for the HyNet SR, which was hydrogen with carbon capture. It was a closed system, but we have issued that permit last year. We already have a plant operating, which is the Winnington Tata plant making bicarb, and the combustion plant associated with that has carbon capture on it. They use a mixture of MEA and another substance, and Just off the top of my head, we had one research plant. We also had to permit because it was a combusting waste that had solvents in there that weren't just monoethanolamine. Yeah. But yes, we are working on cases, or we're working on a case that is a proprietary solvent. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, are there any more questions? I will now hand over back to Gwenda.
Right, just turn my mute back off. So in this section, I'm going to have a brief look at preparing applications and the standards and guidance available for the carbon capture sector. So in terms of the content of applications, the requirements for applications for carbon capture are really essentially no different to other applications. We need the correct forms and payments required, as well as the usual assessments, operating techniques and plans. For your process description and process flow diagrams that you include as required by the application forms, they should include the carbon capture process itself and its associated cooling and water use systems, as well as any links to the process it serves. We need to understand the link back into the process to be able to understand the changes to the supporting lime or cement process. And if there are changes within the lime and cement process, we need to see those process flows and see how what changes there, be able to visualize that. The application should also consider the impact of the capture plant on BAT, on best available techniques, relating to the host plant to the host cement or lime activity. And you need to be able to explain in your application how the BAT will still be met. We did touch on that in Richard's presentation that was to do with hydrogen, but similar, we need to understand whether you can still meet your BAT achievable emission limits and other aspects, particularly things like energy efficiency. On the next slide, Miriam, please. For the carbon capture plant itself, we expect you to provide details of the plant with operating techniques that are in line with our guidance or are equivalent to the standards in the guidance. That's the guidance for emerging technologies for carbon capture. And this slide lists the main points that need to be addressed. It's not an exhaustive list, so just some of the key points. Your application must include, it's really important that we can see this and be able to work through it. It needs to include a systematic review of your operating techniques against the guidance for emerging techniques for carbon capture. And it must include how you can meet, the impacts of the carbon capture on energy efficiency, how your existing process meets any energy efficiency requirements set in the sector BREF or BAT conclusions. We need to be able to understand how the incoming gas is treated and cooled before it enters into the carbon capture unit. You need to explain and justify your choice of solvent selection or choice of capture technology. You need to describe your method to minimize solvent degradation and describe how you're going to remove the degradation products, what will be done with that waste that comes from that. We need a description of the capture efficiency for the carbon dioxide itself, for the carbon itself. We need to understand if that capture efficiency calculation covers abnormal and normal operations and whether it covers startup and shutdown. If it doesn't cover startup and shutdown, we need a justification as to why it doesn't cover that, which would need to be specific to your actual case. And particularly interesting to us, obviously, is your flue gas abatement, what treatment your emissions are subjected to before they leave your carbon capture plant, what water and acid washers you're going to use to minimise, in particular, emissions of amines and amine breakdown products, and also what droplet removal, what's going to be in place to prevent and minimise release of aerosols and particulates coming out of the plant, and particularly because the aerosols are likely to entrain the solvent and take that out and also make monitoring more difficult. Currently, the guidance relates to capture using amines. If you're using a different capture process, you should still provide similar assessments relating to that process, and the guidance is being updated as we go along, and there will be further information added into it as we begin to understand more about other types of technology. Your application must also include proposals for monitoring, both the process and the emissions monitoring, as well as risk assessments. And your risk assessment should include the normal risk assessments, such as noise, which must include the carbon capture plant, and should include the carbon dioxide compression, which will obviously be quite a significant source of noise for most sites. We also expect air emissions assessments, which more than likely will include an initial H1 and then modelling. If it's amines, we'll need to include the amine potential for amine formation after release, as well as modelling amines released directly. We need a description of your CO2 venting for routine and abnormal operations, habitats assessment, and water emissions, taking into account and considering whether there are additional discharges as a result, or changes to existing discharges as a result of the addition of the carbon capture. Where you are proposing to use a solvent-based technology, you'll need to provide details of all the emissions from the absorption and abatement columns. That will be the solvents or amines, if you're using amines, and their breakdown products. You'll need to derive and present to us environmental assessment levels for these substances when there are no published levels. We will be publishing a consultation on derived EALs for a range of substances, together with a revised methodology for deriving your own levels later this year. But our existing guidance on our website already has an assessment of emissions to air, includes our existing published EALs and links to the current method for deriving EALs, and this is what you'd follow whilst awaiting the publication of the new information. For amine solvents, as I've mentioned, that you need to consider nitramine and nitrosamine formation in your emissions assessment. These substances, many of which are harmful, some of which are carcinogenic, are formed in the carbon capture, absorption and abatement towers, but they can also be performed by reactions in air after release of amines. And we've provided links to guidance on assessment of amine emissions to air in our final slide. The next slide, Miriam, thank you. Some useful links in this slide to various guidance documents that will help your application. The links there to the guidance on emerging techniques for energy and net zero for both carbon capture and hydrogen with carbon capture. And also there's obviously the existing relevant guidance, technical guidance for your sector, and the BAT reference documents. So moving on to common issues and how to avoid them. Yes. Following 3 slides set out some of the issues that we've come across in the applications we've received to date, and we've added some points to explain how you can avoid them in the later slides. Common issues which we have observed, which have delayed our duly making or determination of existing permit applications, are listed on this slide. So what are they? They are late submission for the financial investment decision timeline, objections to disclosure and claims for commercial confidentiality, which we cannot uphold, usually relating to emissions, incomplete applications, changes to information and assessments during the determination, significant impacts being predicted due to inadequate mitigation, particularly for nutrient nitrogen impacts, and not recognising what is needed for multi-operator installation. There are understandable reasons for most of these issues arising for carbon capture applications. These are mainly that we've got it's very early stage emerging technology. There's a lot of design uncertainty. We're looking at applications which are submitted to us pre-front-end engineering stage, so pre-front-end engineering's design stage. So there's still uncertainty as to what the design is going to be and which contractor might be providing the technology in some cases. There is also uncertainty about the carbon dioxide compression because the pipelines may not have been specified or are not present for all of the sites that we're looking at. So there is uncertainty as to how many compressors might be employed. We We also have seen issues that where we've got proprietary solvent suppliers have required applicants to sign non-disclosure agreements, which then limits the applicant's understanding of the solvent and the emissions potential, and it also it restricts the information that the applicant has been able to put in their initial application. We've had issues with missing carbon dioxide risk management and venting impacts assessment, again, mainly related to the lack of understanding at the stages they've been submitted about what that compression system is going to look like, what those vents might look like, and how many vents will be employed. They have incomplete impact assessments, mainly relating to not having the relevant emissions profile for the carbon capture technique for the solvents that are going to be used, and generally a lack of published environmental assessment levels, which is requiring the applicant or technology provider to derive their own environmental assessment levels, EALs. We've come up with a couple of slides here now to just talk about how we would advise that you avoid these common issues with your carbon capture applications, looking in the first instance on this slide at processing, what are application processing related issues. Frontline is to, from the top end advice really is to make sure you research our guidance before you start to put together your application. And note very crucially that there are differences in the requirements for a development consent order or a planning application you might have running concurrently or have already gone through than what we need for environmental permitting under the EPR regulations. We advise that you engage early with your area regulator and with our A&B sector leads. We recommend you apply for enhanced pre-app, as this will ensure you can get the latest guidance as things are evolving quickly, and it will mean you can have discussions with ourselves alongside environment and business and with your regulatory compliance officer if you wish them to be there as well. And we can do these as virtual meetings so they can be done very efficiently. We recommend you do this as early as you can, as this will ensure and help you to submit a good quality application in sufficient time for determination and in order to meet your financial investment decision deadline. We also think you should consider using an appropriate consultancy who specialises in environmental permitting regulations applications, as opposed to consultancies who are mainly concerned with planning applications. So have a look at that and consider that and see what expertise you have in-house for that, because the application is essentially the same as any other variation you're applying. It's not just about the carbon capture plant, it's about the impacts and of that plant on how your process is operating and any changes to your emissions as well. If there are parts of the proposal that are not yet finalised, then consider applying as a staged application, because this can mean your process can be commenced earlier while you finalise these aspects. That's the duly making process, that is. And just going back to the planning and DCO issues, we require that the documents that you submit to us, that you do actually submit the documents to us for your planning, for your EPR application, and you don't assume that we have access to any planning documents that you've previously submitted. It also means that you should submit the documents in the format that we need them in and require them, because we have some different requirements for things like air quality assessment than you would need for your planning application. If you're proposing to submit an application based on using a simple monoethanolamine, MEA, as a solvent, in order to obtain your permit by your financial investment decision deadline, but you're actually intending in the long term to switch to a new or different proprietary solvent in the capture plant, you still need to provide to us in your application all the information relevant to use of monoethanolamine in your application. We need this as we have to be able to determine a permit for an activity which is operational or likely to be able to be operated. So we have to be able to determine the permit as if you were going to operate it with the solvent you've said you're going to operate it with. If you use this approach and you apply for a permit for using monoethanolamine or other simple amine, then you will have to vary the permit once you've decided on the actual solvent you're going to use further down the line. That's assuming we issue you the permit. You're going to have to vary that. And then to do that variation, you'll need to resubmit all the information again as part of this variation, all specific to the new solvent. Very importantly, if you're going to do this, you need to consider at your initial application stage that if the emission profile from the solvent, the proprietary solvent you might intend to switch to, is different to monoethanolamine or whatever more simple amine that you're proposing, and whether the abatement system you're proposing is going to be suitable to deal with elevated emissions impact risks from a switch away from MEA, from monoethanolamine. For example, some proprietary solvents have more complex amines, which are more likely to convert to nitrosamines and nitramines, either in the system or in air after release. So you need to ensure that you've got an abatement system that will be able to meet the very, very minimal levels of amine releases and nitrosamine releases that you could, the lowest you can possibly achieve, and they must then need to be insignificant at the receptors. So it's one thing doing your assessment for monoethanolamine, but if you're then intending to change to a different solvent, that assessment needs to be good enough, and that abatement plant needs to be good enough for that new solvent. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem when you come to your variation. If you enter into a non-disclosure agreement with a solvent supplier because they wish to keep their solvent confidential, you must consider the implications. You as the operator at the plant will be responsible for managing the risks from the storage, handling and use of the solvent. So you need to know what these are, and we need to know this too. And we also need to be able to properly understand what the emissions are. We need to know what the emissions are. We need to know exactly what those solvents are, what those breakdown products are, and we need to be able to publish this because it goes on the public register if it's emissions. If it's related to emissions. We also need to provide this information to our statutory consultee, the UK Health Security Agency, and they may need to be able to do a full assessment of the toxicology data that's involved in that risk assessment, so they need all of this information as well. Looking a bit more detail at the technical issues on the next slide, Miriam. As carbon capture is an emerging technology, we don't have information on how the plants will actually perform against the assumptions made in the application. So you will need to consider over-design of the abatement systems to ensure that emissions will meet the limits. And it's better to include this over-designed abatement in the initial design stage rather than try to retrofit in the future. In your application, you need to assess the impact of emissions to water as well as to air. And you should also assess and provide information on the fates of any amines or breakdown products, and taking into account whether there's any point on your process or on your carbon dioxide dewatering, for example, where those amines and breakdown products may come into contact with water. You should also take into account how the addition of the carbon capture plant impacts on the performance of your existing cement and lime process. You'll be, as we said before, you'll be required to meet the BAT standards and limits for your sectors, so your application should provide details of what the impacts are, how you will still be able to meet the standards. And these could be standards for the emissions or standards for energy efficiency. For applications where the carbon capture plant is operated by a different operator, so it's a multi-operator installation, assessments need to take into account the installation as a whole. That's been mentioned before. And very importantly, there are likely to be a number of pre-operational and improvement conditions set in a permit. If we decide to issue you a permit, there will be quite a number of these, which will require you to submit revised impact assessments based on the final designs and also on validation of assumptions. Finally, there are just some useful resources if you want to know more about carbon capture. And these cover some of the emerging techniques and are more relevant to this high complexity permitting. This is the links to a number of useful documents, guidance and legislation that's relevant for making an application. Any questions?
Okay, I've got one from Andy Jackson.
Hi, thanks for that. You alluded to the point about EPR and DCO and needing the documents for EPR to be direct and not assuming that they come via the DCO. Does that mean that the EPR process has to operate in advance of the DCO, or is the timing parallel? How does it work?
It doesn't have to be parallel or in advance. We operate separately, but you will have. This is from our perspective. Mira and I are in permitting, so that's slightly different than the area people. Your area regulator or someone else within the area will be part of your DCO, will be a statutory consultee on that, so they will deal with you on that, and then we get involved in it in permitting when you are at sort of at the pre-app or at application stage. You might ask for your permit before you've got your planning permission. You might ask for it while you're applying for your planning permission or DCO. There's no direct connection between what we will grant and what you're doing with the planning side of things. They used to be linked, but no, they're not linked anymore. So it means that we don't, if you want us to consider information, it needs to come to us in permitting. It also needs to come in the right format. So there are very different air quality reports that get submitted for DCO than what we need and to have in permitting. But they're not very different, but they're quite different.
Any more questions? We've got 3 minutes of our 3 hours left. We've done very well. So I just say there've been plenty of email addresses that have been sent out and will be on the PowerPoint slides as well. So obviously, if there are questions, do feed them back to us. So I just want to say a really big thank you to all our presenters. It's been a really useful session. I hope it's been really useful for you. There's obviously been a range of different presentations as well. I just want to go through a few very sort of high level key points because obviously we've had quite a lot of information. We're tracking potential technologies for deployment in decarbonisation so that we can be prepared to regulate them, and that includes issuing a permit. That preparation includes development of guidance, and that's usually as GET, Guidance for Emerging Techniques, as novel technologies are not covered by existing BAT. That process can take some time, so early engagement with us as a regulator is key. We've considered NOx ELVs for plant burning hydrogen in the combustion sector, but not other sectors yet. That is work in progress, so we haven't considered, we haven't produced anything for cement and lime yet. Please be aware and plan for any potential environmental capacities or constraints, such as water supply. And if you're part of a cluster, that will be key because you've got a sort of multiplication of the same issues. And we strongly recommend enhanced pre-app to help you prepare your permit application. And this is particularly important for new technologies. And you will need to refer to any GET if available to justify your choice of plant and process. Good applications will result in a quicker determination of the permit. And as we've said, determination of new technology permits is complex and lengthy. And finally, we want to support you in your decarbonisation. So please work with us. So our talk today very much where we're up to today. We're constantly progressing. And so having engagement with our operators will help us target the work that we are doing from here. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and I hope it's been useful for you. We'll share all the presentations, and thanks to presenters too, and I'll hand back to Michael to close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonie. Yes, just want to extend my thanks to all the presenters today, everyone joining us this afternoon, also to Leonie for assistance with organising today. Just to mention that, as previously mentioned, a copy of the recording will be made available after the meeting. Copies, as mentioned, as Leonie mentioned, copy of the presentations will be made available, and other potential email addresses that are not included in the presentations will be made available after the meeting. We'll also be circulating a feedback form, which we'd kindly like everyone to fill out. This will help with the EA's organisation of subsequent events of this nature. Mentioned before, this is a first of a kind, so please do provide feedback on that because it will go into, say, future events. And yeah, just say thank you very much for this afternoon, and hope you found this useful.
Thank you all.
Thank you
very much. Bye.